Good evening. My name is Vicky Hiffa, and I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. And on behalf of the DDPC, I want to welcome you and all of our viewers across the state and country on Livestream to the premiere screening of our documentary, The Path Forward, Remembering Willowbrook. Thank you for being a part of this important conversation. The idea for a documentary came to us about a year ago when we began producing a series of videos commemorating the 50th anniversary of Geraldo Rivera's expose. Our first interview in this series was with Geraldo and Bernard Carabello, and what they had to say was so compelling we thought, there is more of this story that we need to tell. We were then fortunate to be able to interview other key people in the Willowbrook story, many of whom are here with us tonight. They are all such strong advocates and are so inspiring, and I'm really pleased that they'll be available to answer questions after the screening. We are so fortunate to have this very impressive group who lived this story sharing our stage this evening. Our title for the documentary is The Path Forward. So while what happened at Willowbrook was certainly a dark period in our state's history, we can also celebrate the fact that we are on the path forward, and people with disabilities are now able to live more fully included lives in the community of their choosing. However, as we all know, we need to learn from the past so we never make the same mistakes again and must never forget what happened at Willowbrook. This documentary is the result of a great partnership with media services at the Office of General Services, and I want to especially thank Joe Walsh, our producer, for his creativity, passion, and dedication to this project. I also want to thank two DDPC staff, Gina Bowman and Drew Webster, for all of their hard work and dedication to both the documentary and the event this evening. Finally, I want to thank our sponsor, Maureen O'Brien, and her team at the New York State Industries for the Disabled for their great partnership with this event. There are a few people here tonight that I want to also mention. Kim Hill, the Governor's Chief Disabilities Officer, is here, as well as Clarence Sundrum, who is a national expert on conditions at institutions. Assemblymember Seawright, Chair of the Assembly Committee on Disabilities, and other members of the legislature are also here with us. Thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. We also have many of our DDPC council members here tonight, and I want to thank them for all of their support and guidance that they've provided to our agency. So I'd like to end my remarks by sharing a quote from Margaret Mead, which I think is very fitting for our documentary, our panelists, and all the current and future advocates in our audience tonight. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. I am now pleased to introduce Kerri Neifeld, who is the Commissioner of the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, who would like to say a few words this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky, for that introduction. I'm Kerri Neifeld. I'm the Commissioner at OPWDD, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight for this special screening. I want to thank the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council for their invitation and for their year-round advocacy for people with developmental disabilities. DDPC has been an incredible partner in advancing our mission-related projects like supported decision-making, regional centers for workforce transformation, and our crisis program, New York Start, just to name a very few of the things we've collaborated on. And thank you to our MC for tonight, WTEN's Christina Arangio, who is also a parent advocate to her son, Luke. I see so many familiar faces. I won't begin to even try to name everybody because I'll get in trouble, I'll forget people. But there's a great turnout here tonight of people with disabilities, their families, providers, advocates, many of our legislators, Assemblywoman Seawright, many of our OPWDD and DDPC staff people. I also want to acknowledge and thank our powerful partner, Governor Hochul, for all the support that she has provided to people with developmental disabilities since taking office. She's focused on making New York State a national leader in providing services for people with developmental disabilities. Just over a year ago, the governor appointed New York's first Chief Disability Officer, Kim Hill, who's also here tonight, as Vicky said. Kim's appointment was something that people with disabilities have been advocating for many years in making one step in making New York State a more inclusive state. I'm very grateful for Kim's partnership. In tonight's panel discussion, we will hear from parents, siblings, and former staff and residents of Willowbrook. Their firsthand accounts of the conditions that people experienced while institutionalized were the catalysts for change. Advocacy is something that we hear a lot about, especially during certain times of the year, like right now during budget negotiations, and all throughout this month as we acknowledge Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. But for the people in this room, advocacy isn't just rolled out once a year. Advocacy is a year-round, lifelong job, one that you do for yourselves, for your loved ones, and for others like you and them. Advocates are some of OPWDD's most valued partners. They make our system strong and rich. Whether you're speaking up for yourself as someone with a developmental disability, or you're speaking up on behalf of someone who you love who benefits from supports and services, your voices matter and your challenges are our challenges. Your work has the power to change lives and to change systems, as our history has shown us. The film we're going to see tonight is aptly titled The Path Forward, Remembering Willowbrook. That path began 50 years ago with parents like Willie Mae Goodman, who you will hear from on tonight's panel. Goody is a constant advocate for her daughter, Marguerite, who was a former Willowbrook resident. She spoke up for the children of Willowbrook, who until then did not have a voice to sound the alarm about the injustices that were happening to them. And she'll tell you, I'm sure she'll tell you tonight, that she marched the streets until things changed. We also have an inspirational self-advocate on tonight's panel, Bernard Carabello. Bernard spent his childhood surviving unthinkable things at Willowbrook and was courageous enough to tell his story to Geraldo Rivera when he was just a young man. Today, Bernard is one of the community's most storied advocates, having started the Self-Advocacy Association of New York State in 1986 and serving as an ombudsman for OPWDD. We'll hear from Jose Rivera and Dr. Debra Weissbach, whose siblings were at Willowbrook and whose experiences inspired them to dedicate their careers to advancing the lives of people with developmental disabilities. We'll hear from Diane Buglioli, former staff at Willowbrook, who was brave enough to speak out about her experiences against the atrocities that she witnessed. We'll hear from Dr. Catherine Lavender, who is the co-chair of the Willowbrook Legacy Committee and whose work helped to ensure the establishment of the Willowbrook Mile on the College of Staten Island, which exists to forever acknowledge what happened on that property and to keep it in our minds why we must continue to fight to change it. These are advocates who took experiences of adversity and turned them into the inspiration upon which a whole new system was built, a system that aspires to ensure community involvement and inclusion for people who were once locked away from society. We're all familiar with the history of what Willowbrook represented in its past. It's a history of ignorance and abuse and of viewing people with developmental disabilities as a burden to society instead of the valuable members that they are. 50 years ago, it was not possible that people with developmental disabilities would live among their neighbors in communities of their choosing. Choice is not a word that was mentioned 50 years ago to the parents of children residing at Willowbrook. People were not presented with the options that are available today, the chance for a full life in their community and a wide system of support in place to help them thrive. I think about some of the things we've been able to accomplish together: integrated independent housing, a thriving self-direction program, legislation that helps people to succeed in employment opportunities. I'm proud of the work that we have done so far. I know that remembering Willowbrook as it was is very difficult, but it serves as a stark reminder that we can always do better and why we must keep fighting for acceptance, understanding, and appreciation for people of all abilities. All of our worlds expand when we imagine the possibilities and challenge old ways of thinking. The lives of people with developmental disabilities are certainly made richer by opportunities, but so are all of our lives. Our communities thrive when they are open and welcoming to a diverse community of members, including those with developmental disabilities. Our communities are stronger when we have meaningful and valued places in the world for everyone. I look forward to working with everyone here tonight as we continue to honor the legacy of what happened at Willowbrook by constantly pushing forward for progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your remarks and for your agency's great partnership with the DDPC. As you note, the DDPC advocates for people with disabilities and their family members year-round and is proud to be able to develop innovative projects that help people with disabilities live as independently as possible in the community of their choosing. And now, without further ado, we will start the screening of our documentary. Thank you.
I visited the state institutions for the mentally retarded, and I think particularly at Willowbrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake pit, and that the children live in filth. I think all of us are at fault, and I think it's just it's long overdue that something be done about it.
How long have you been at Willowbrook?
18 years.
How is it living on the ward that you live?
Disgrace.
The attendants are trying their best, but the staff is just too small to do anything more than just try and keep the place clean. When there's only one person to take care of 30 or 40, nothing good can possibly happen. No rehabilitation, no training, nothing. The attendants are as much the victim of the conditions here as the patients are.
My problem with telling the story 50 years later is that I'm like Pavlov's dog. I react and I get flashed back to that, to the obscene, the torture of the residents, the inmates there. It was something so utterly terrible that it was almost unbelievable.
This was a secret enclave. The system had set up a way that would not allow any ordinary people to see what was going on inside these brick buildings.
I was given this key on that first day of work. Pretty heavy steel key that you can see. I was told to go to a certain building, and I went there and I opened one door. It was a very heavy metal door. Turned the key, opened it, and I walked a couple of steps and I had to open a second door. I was directed down to the end of the hall. There was another steel door. At 19 years of age, I basically said to myself, what have I gotten myself into? Who is locked behind 3 steel doors? Pushed the door open, and when I walked in, on the other side of the door were 40 toddlers. And why in God's name were they locked behind 3 steel doors?
When I applied for my job, I was really never taken to any of the wards. They just accepted my application and they told me when I would start. And then I went to Building 6, which was my building. And the building supervisor opened the door to the day room, and there was the chaos.
You have no idea what was inside, no idea the savagery, the squalor, the illness, the infectiousness, the violence that was just the norm every day.
It had a stink to it that got into your clothes and into your skin. How unattended, it was hell on earth.
Why would you continue to allow people to share bathrooms with no doors on the stalls when you know 100% of them get hepatitis within 6 months of entering, and when the incidence of intestinal parasites and worms was incredibly high?
When I used to give out cookies and candy, they used to throw it on the floor, and they all get down and grab it. And I never I never told nobody that. It happened. It happened.
Mind you, this is only 50 years ago. We're not talking about the dark ages. We are still responsible. We're not talking about great grandparents and, ancient history. This is our world, our universe. This happened in our universe on our watch. It's mind-blowing.
Well, Willowbrook has a long history, obviously, on this site. It actually was first chartered 75 years ago, and in the charter it was described as a school for the education of what they then termed mental defectives, what we now would say probably would be people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. So it started out with this goal of educating and training people, and much of the coverage that you might see in the newspapers then was designed to encourage people to see this as a good option for their children. But very quickly, through underfunding and understaffing, it became really quite unlivable. At its height, it had about 3 times as many people living in its wards as the place was designed to accommodate.
I would get calls, for example, at the beginning that say to me, somebody's acting out. You need to sign a straitjacket order. You need to sign a Thorazine shot to cool them down. And I didn't understand what was going on here at first. Really, it took me a year to really see and figure out the evil, the relentless cruelty that was built into this system to maintain the status quo.
Lack of privacy, and that many of the people were, at that time, because of the budget cuts, there weren't enough changes of clothing to go around, so there was nudity, chaos.
Nobody came into these buildings. Not the director of this place, nobody came into those buildings. They were sealed off, as coffins. They were living coffins for devalued people.
I am the younger sister of a previous resident of Willowbrook who lived here for 10 years before he died in 1968. He actually became a bit of a family secret. I was told that I didn't visit because I didn't want to go at the age of 3. I believe my mother never went because it was too painful. Doctors, social workers, and the belief at that time was, in a situation like this, your best bet is to drop your child off and they will get cared for and to move on with your life. And that is what my parents tried to do. My mother never, ever forgave herself. Ever.
When you worked here, if you continued to work here, you had to become a little bit impervious. You had to be able to deal with this. I always say that we became a little bit institutionalized because this was such a surreal thing. But if I left, who's going to come? I mean, I felt I could do something. Maybe I could change what was happening on a daily basis.
My brother died on July 4th, 1968. I was always under the impression that his death was due to some type of trauma. What I was told subsequently was that he had perforated his stomach, and the assumption was based upon what I had learned in secrecy by reading, bits and pieces, was that he probably had been either abused by caregivers or that there had been some kind of traumatic event, with another resident.
I was just a year older than my brother, Louis Rivera, who was placed in Willowbrook State School at the age of 5. My mother would undress my brother as a way of assessing, was he gaining weight? Were there any bruises? Were there any marks? That's how families tried to monitor the care, because we weren't allowed to ask any questions.
My little girl was 2 years old, and we never knew where the children slept or who fed them. The first visit, I had to cut her hair because it was matted. The director sent me a letter and told me if I didn't like it, they'd take her out. So I got on the bus that next day. I came out to Willowbrook. I sat there all day long until about 4 o'clock. Secretary said, "We're closing now, you got to leave." I said, "I'm not going in the place." And finally, he decided to meet with me. He didn't even look up at me. I said, well, get someone to take the letter. I'll sign it. I'll take her out. I said, before I take her out, I'm gonna call the news media. And that's when he asked me, did I want a cup of coffee?
That's the beginnings of advocacy.
Before Geraldo Rivera's expose, there was a young reporter, Jane Curtin, who went to Willowbrook and actually did a series of articles exposing the conditions. She was joined by Eric Arts, who was a photojournalist who took some powerful photographs of the horrific conditions there. So Jane really was the first to really bring public awareness to what was happening at Willowbrook.
I got to know then Mike Wilkins and Bill Bronston. They contacted me and told me that there was something that I should see, that they thought that I would be able to write about it. And they had faith, I think, in my perspective on things. They walked me through the front door. I mean, I was with people who were taking chances, but there had been no prior exposure, so there were no alarm bells. So it was just three people going through the front door.
Nobody really believed it. When Jane Curtin did her articles in the Staten Island Advance, there were a couple of still photos, but still nobody believed it. And we were being denounced from pulpits and other politicians not believing us, and they were thinking we were just radicals bad-mouthing an institution that was doing its best.
The first thing I began to do was to bring the families inside to show them why their kids were being destroyed, why every time they come, their kid would be more and more damaged, more and more injured.
Bill Bronston and I quickly observed and concluded that the most progressive element in that institution was the parents.
That led to meetings where I began to set up seminars for the families in order to understand why they had to get their kids out of here.
The parents got involved, they got organized, they got confident because their meetings were really big. We had a meeting of one Sunday with a large group of parents. The director, Dr. Jack Hammond, was invited. He was asked to take a public stand against the conditions where there weren't enough clothes, there wasn't enough staff. He refused. He said, I've been in this business for a long time and it won't work. They ejected him from the meeting at that point. That was a Sunday. And that following Monday, there was a memorandum circulated through the institution saying that no employee was allowed to attend a meeting of the parents' organization. But the next Sunday, I did attend, and so did Bill. And then we were promptly given our pink slips.
The supervisor in Building 6, a nice guy, but it was his job to hand me my pink slip and tell me I was fired, and I was pretty stunned. And his hand was shaking, and in his anxiety, he forgot to ask for the key. And I didn't remember that I had it. So I got home, and there it was. And so, of course, it made me think, because one of my thoughts was, man, if people just knew, if they just knew about this place and could see it for themselves, nobody would put up with it. And so I slept on it, and the next day I called Geraldo, who I happen to know him from before.
Well, Mike called me at one point and said that he had just been fired from Willowbrook. And I said, what's Willowbrook? It sounded so nice, that lyrical name, the Willowbrook. I thought it was like a country club. He said he had just been fired and that the conditions there were so appalling that he thought it would be a great story for us to tell. And I listened. I had no experience at all with either institutions or with the developmentally disabled. So I was utterly unprepared for the reality of Willowbrook. I was horrified. I was appalled. It was beyond belief how horrible it was, how filthy it was. It was hell on earth. It was really, I mean, I was an experienced person, very urban, very savvy, did all kinds of, drug abuse stories, and, I was a tough guy. But when I saw Willowbrook, it was something that seared my soul. The administrators had a colder, academic, excusing in a way as thinking that we were naive, that there was something that we were missing. And I think that my ignorance was my strength, in the sense that I looked at it and said, are you kidding me? I mean, you have children unattended and smeared with their own feces and wailing under the sinks, their pants down around their ankles, eating slop. I mean, what is it that I don't understand?
The conditions are getting worse every time they cut the budget more and more.
I got back to the eyewitness newsroom, and there were a barrage of calls from New York State officials, angrily denouncing our trespassing and threatening lawsuits, and without authorization violated the privacy of the residents.
But there's no privacy anyway.
There was no privacy anyway, very eloquently stated. They lived, everything, all communal. So to his credit, Al Primo, the director of Eyewitness News, and the assignment editors said, okay, they suspended judgment. The film came back from the lab. They saw the film. Everyone's spine stiffened, and they said, we're going to go with this story. It changed the world.
But even Bernard, with his tragically eloquent plea for help, doesn't really understand that what Willowbrook needs isn't more money. More money would certainly help. At least the kids would have clothes and they'd be cleaner than they are now, but they'd still basically be human vegetables in a detention camp. What we need is a new approach. We have to change the way we care for our mentally retarded. We ask for change, we demand change.
The question was, what was the solution to this place? They wanted to fix it, of course. They wanted to pour another few millions of dollars into this place because they didn't have another alternative paradigm in their head. And our job was to stop them from fixing this place and to shut it down. We went into the federal court in order to try and get an emergency intervention. The lawyers brought in the top leaders in the United States to talk about what quality services for people with special needs look like. Their testimony was just amazing. It was the first time that the reality of habilitation services, of individualized developmental services, was articulated in a court situation. And so as the trial went on, finally, the judge decided to get up off of his bench and come and take a look. And that closed the deal. Once he saw it, once he walked through it, no matter what they did to clean it up. And they tried to clean it up.
The expose really led to major changes in the disability system in this country, and various laws were passed which were designed to protect people with disabilities. In 1975 alone, 3 significant laws were enacted, leading up to the passage of the Civil Rights for Institutionalized Persons Act, which protects the rights of people with disabilities in institutional facilities, followed by the official closure of Willowbrook in 1987, paving the way for the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990.
Did I take you back into Willowbrook?
I never went back.
You never went back, yeah. I wish that I never did.
So after Bernard left Willowbrook, he went on to become a civil rights activist for people with developmental disabilities and really was a driving force behind the creation of the statewide Self-Advocacy Association of New York State, or SANYS as it's called. So he went on to do some great things after he left Willowbrook.
We're not there yet, but we're getting there with all the advocacy, parents advocacy, self-advocates, SANYS, and because of Bernard Carabello, it's all started because of him, and we're grateful.
You know, we got a long way to go. This is gonna go on forever until we change our attitude about people with developmental disabilities.
Bernard he went on to have a career in advocacy. Where would he have been if he'd never met Wilkins and Bronson? He became a symbol of a potential realized.
Willowbrook affected the entire world. It is the ground zero for disability rights.
What I saw in my brother was a desire to live, a desire to experience the world as we know it, that was deprived and denied of him by virtue of the institutionalization that he was subject to.
I think it's also important to remember that there were probably thousands of children who never survived being here, and they need to be remembered too.
The cost is a human cost, and being robbed of that potential in one's life is just a tragedy we would never want to see repeated again.
There's no way to go ahead without remembering what happened in the past, because it gives us direction. It tells us we have learned this lesson. There's a duality for me with Willowbrook. I think back about some of the saddest things that I saw here, and then I think about the fact that this little boy, Josh, that learned to walk when he was 8 only because there was no one helping him, that he took his first steps to me. And when you grow up in an institution, we stunt that curiosity. So I think about the sadness of it, but I think about Josh walking towards me and how that filled me.
Those images that we saw in Geraldo Rivera's expose, or in the photographs by Eric Arts that appeared in the Staten Island Advance, the images that make us hurt, that's not that whole person. That is that person in that historical moment. It's important to remember that these are people with voices and dreams and hopes.
The very first word that comes to mind is the one that came to mind for decades, which is shame. For me, it was a source of great shame that this happened to my brother. Over the years, and especially now, I don't really feel shame anymore. I actually, especially today, I'm extremely grateful. I'm just grateful for the work that was done by Geraldo Rivera, by the activist physicians and parents, and unfortunately, my family did not benefit from that. It was too late for us, but not too late for so many others.
When the doctors called me 50 years ago to tell me of this expose that needed airing on television, Jane Curtin's fine work at the Advance, to advance that story, of course I had no idea that 50 years later, 35 years after the closing of this terrible institution, we would be gathered here celebrating the progress, guarding against deterioration and budget cuts and so forth. But the world has changed for the developmentally disabled. They have come out of the shadows.
The ribbon cutting today of opening the mile is a formal action of remembering the past to protect the future. For now, it's about people walking on this mile, walking on this property, and starting to really critically think and take steps. And they can take personal actions to make sure that this never happens again. Be the change that you want to see.
That's exciting to me, to see what has been built on the ashes of that, the phoenix that has risen from those ashes. And that's the legacy.
Okay. I can't watch that without getting emotional every time. I've seen it 100 times. Okay. I'm now so pleased to introduce Christina Arangio, who will be moderating our panel discussion. Christina is an anchor for the Edward R. Murrow award-winning News 10 ABC in the Morning. She also anchors the New News as an Emmy-nominated reporter and has worked as an anchor reporter for the ABC affiliates in Orlando and Pittsburgh. Christina is also a strong inclusion advocate. Her son has Down syndrome, is fully mainstreamed in school, and Christina shares his journey on social media to help others. We are thrilled to have her here with us tonight to lead our discussion. Christina, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vicky, for inviting me to be a part of this very special evening, and I'm honored that you asked me to moderate the panel discussion. I know many of us are still catching our breath after watching the documentary. That's the 4th time I've seen it. Had a chance to look at it earlier, and it is still painful to see the images, to think of what those living at Willowbrook went through. It's absolutely heartbreaking. But this is the path forward now. It's so important that we show this video and talk about the legacy of Willowbrook. So thank you to all of you in the audience. Great turnout tonight. I know you all felt compelled to be here, and many of you likely want to see a lot more change. And to our panelists, who I will introduce individually in just a few moments, we owe you a debt of gratitude. Thank you. As the mother of a 13-year-old boy with Down syndrome who is thriving and mainstreamed in school, I know how drastically different Luke's life would be, along with countless others with developmental disabilities, were it not for your courage and your commitment. Thank you for pushing for change, for sounding the alarm, for your tremendous advocacy. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I know they feel the same. And as a journalist, I'm so thankful that Geraldo Rivera and Jane Curtin with the Staten Island Advance exposed the truth about Willowbrook. Change cannot happen without speaking up, without exposing what's wrong, without advocacy. And like so many others, I work hard to advocate for my child, to help him reach his full potential. And as many here likely know, it can be a struggle and a challenge, especially in school. But it is so worth it. We certainly don't have all the answers here tonight. So to our audience, a friendly reminder that the panelists are answering questions specifically related to Willowbrook experiences and how to continue our advocacy moving forward, despite the hurdles. We know there are hurdles, but it's a critical lesson, the advocacy. That's how we will continue to affect change. So without further ado, it is my pleasure and it is my honor to introduce the panelists tonight. Dr. Bernard Carabello. The first self-advocate. You inspire us all. We know from watching the documentary that you spent 18 years at Willowbrook, and you were interviewed by Geraldo Rivera as part of the expose. And after you left Willowbrook, you went on to become a civil rights activist for people with disabilities, one of the founders of the Self-Advocacy Association of New York, also known as SANYS. Dr. Carabello, thank you so much for being a part of this critical discussion. Diane Buglioli, got that right? Italian, right? Fellow Italian. Diane started working at Willowbrook when she was just 19 years old, and I know you saw this in the documentary. Following the closure of Willowbrook, Diane became the co-founder of a very special place on Staten Island that provides services and residential opportunities for more than 1,200 people with developmental disabilities. Thank you for what you continue to do for people with developmental disabilities, for speaking up, for doing all you could when you were at Willowbrook. Dr. Debra Weissbach. As you heard in the documentary, Debra is the sibling of a former Willowbrook resident, Robert, who died while at Willowbrook. Today, she is a practicing pediatrician, helping many, many children. Dr. Weissbach, thank you for being here, and our deepest sympathies about your brother. It's so important that we hear from you as well. You're such an important part of this conversation, too. So thank you. Jose Rivera. Jose is the brother of a former Willowbrook resident, Louis, and you saw the pictures of Louis. Today, he is the corporate compliance officer for the Cerebral Palsy Association of Nassau County, continuing to advocate for others and helping people with developmental disabilities. Thank you for all you do. I know it wasn't easy for you with your brother. Willie Mae Goodman. Willie Mae Goodman is the parent of Margaret, who is a former resident at Willowbrook. Ms. Goodman has been a long-time advocate, a champion for people with disabilities. And just as Bernard was the first self-advocate, I feel like Willie Mae was the first parent advocate. And so you inspire me and so many others tremendously. We need your voice so much. Thank you so much for all you've done and continue to do. And finally, Dr. Catherine Lavender. Catherine is director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at the College of Staten Island, which is on the former Willowbrook site, as you saw. She's also the co-chair of the Willowbrook Legacy Committee. And as you so eloquently stated, we have to learn from the past. It's so critical that we talk about the legacy of Willowbrook and what we can do to find that path forward. So thank you for being a part of this. So we have questions to ask each of them, and we'll start with that, and we can open it up. Yeah. Oh, Dr. Wilkins is with us. Forgive me, Dr. Wilkins. I am so glad you're here via Zoom. Please forgive me. Dr. Michael Wilkins. Hey. Bernard's saying hi to you. Dr. Wilkins. Dr. Wilkins, who you saw in the documentary as well, worked at Willowbrook as a full-time doctor and began organizing parent groups to advocate for changes at the institution. He's the whistleblower. He's responsible for contacting Geraldo Rivera to expose the horrific conditions at Willowbrook, which led to major changes in the disability field. Dr. Wilkins, thank you so much for having the courage to do what you did and for all you continue to do. Let's start with our questions now. Bernard, this one's for you. We know after you left Willowbrook, you became a civil rights activist for people with disabilities. Talk to us about what inspired you to become such a strong advocate for people with disabilities. I am amazed that after being at Willowbrook for 18 years, you have been able to come so far. What inspired you?
Dr. King.
Dr. King.
Yeah. He was the biggest civil rights activist in the United States. One day I thought about we need to give people with developmental disabilities a platform and to hear their voices also.
We need to give them a platform and hear their voices also, and Dr. King inspired him.
When I first became activist, the first thing I had to change, they were calling people clients, residents, handicapped people. I had to get rid of all that stuff. They never look at us as real people. They look at us as handicapped people who may never do anything to make a difference in life. But we pull the hell out of them.
They never looked at them as people. They just looked at them as those with disabilities. But you showed them.
And we have to remember a woman who died 2 weeks ago. Judy, I forgot how. And Mike. Yes, thank you. She died 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
She was one of the greatest activists in America. She was the Assistant Secretary of the Clinton administration and the Obama administration.
Part of the Obama administration.
Yeah.
Yes.
And back in the 80s, she decided to hold up TWAL for 5 hours because they refused to sit by the emergency door. She lost the fight in federal court, but she made her point. I think we need to hear all people's voices, regardless of who we are. They will help make changes.
We need to hear many voices to make those changes.
Yes.
We need to hear from everyone.
Yes.
Thank you, Bernard.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Diane, in the documentary, you talked about how growing up in an institution rather than the warmth and support of a home really impacted the Willowbrook residents and You saw it firsthand. Talk about how institutionalization affected these children, that isolation, being away from traditional society.
You know, Vicky had asked us to think of a word that would summarize for us what Willowbrook was, one word. And of course, that's difficult. But the one word that I kept thinking about was detached. Detached. Because the people that lived there and the people who worked there, because I believe we became institutionalized as well, because I don't know how else we could have stayed within that setting. Buildings were overcrowded. So a building that was supposed to have 60 people in it, or 70 people in it, had 140 people in it. Instead of 2 people working with, or more, you're right, Bernard, or more. Instead of 2 people working with maybe 20 people, there would be 2 attendants, which were what the direct care professionals would call them, were attendants. There would be 2 for 40. How much time can that individual, first of all, none of us were trained. I started there at 19, you saw my picture. I mean, I'm 73 now, so I'm happy to see myself young again. I just said to one of the reporters, I feel like a dinosaur, not only with technology, but with age, but I'm a dinosaur that speaks, so I can still share with you my experiences, right? How much time can a staff person, untrained for the most part, spend with each individual person? So when that little guy, Josh, walked, which was between the ages of 6 and 8, it's because children are how curious. You see your kids or your grandchildren or your nieces and nephews, they get up on that chair to look to see what's over there. And then their mom goes and they follow and they crawl and they walk, but children in an institution don't have that. There were no furniture in these places, right? The bedrooms, there weren't bedrooms, right? They were dorm rooms, and it was one bed, one right after another. Sometimes in that room, the kids would walk along the bed to get to the next bed, right? And so there's no place, there's no personal space. The impact of that on a person is tremendous. And my memories of Willowbrook, I mean, Bernard and I can sometimes sit and talk, and there were some pretty funny things that happened at Willowbrook because these people were growing up there, so there still were little things that happened there. But the vignettes are the things I remember. And the one I want to tell you about, to talk about the impact on children. I'm taking a group of kids for a walk, and I notice that one of them is limping. So I tell her, what's wrong? Nothing. We walk a little bit further and she's limping. So I say to her, maybe you have a stone in your shoe. And I have 12 kids with me because that was the staff ratio, right? 1 to 12. That was about the best you could get. So I said, everybody sit down because we're not going, there was a carousel on the grounds of Willowbrook, a big, big carousel. And I said, we're not going to the carousel until I open and I look in that shoe. So finally she lets me open the shoe. And there's this bulge on her sock. And I'm thinking it's a rock. What could it be? So I take her sock off, and now she's really angry with me. And she's saying, Diane, no, mine. And I said, I'll give it back to you. Let me just see. You got a bruise on your foot. Let me look at it. I take it, and it's like this wad of paper. And it's like plaster of Paris. What is this? So I take it, and I start to unfold it, like you would a crumpled piece of paper. But this was very dense. I kept opening it and opening it and opening it. And then when it was finally opened, and she's yelling at me that it's hers, it was a birthday card from her mother. And it said to so-and-so, it didn't say to so-and-so, it had a name, to Susan, love always, Mom. There wasn't a single place in her life where she could keep that. She didn't have a locker. She didn't have a closet. The clothes weren't hers. The shoes weren't hers. The underwear wasn't hers. There were just the building number on the back of them. There was nothing. There was nothing personal. There was nothing normal about this. This was chaos. I think Mike used the word chaos. This was chaos. This was not a care system. This was a holding cell for people.
And it's why this is so important tonight, because Willowbrook is not just those buildings that were closed, right? It's that concept that somehow this could be okay. People were locked away in the buildings of Willowbrook, but if people do not have services and they're locked out of services, it's the same thing, really. Not realizing people's potential, not giving them the simple, essential things that people need to grow. They need to be cared for. They need to see love. And Willowbrook should never, ever happen again. But there were people there, like myself, untrained as I was. I would say, I can't give a percentage, Bernard. I don't know what number you would say, but 85% of the staff were just trying to survive there and do what they could. And then there was a percentage there that never should have worked there.
I disagree.
Yeah, we're going to argue about percentages, right? That's our perspective. Bernard and I are always going to...
No.
Okay.
Come on, you're overdoing it. I say about 45.
Well, okay. So, okay, let's do this. Can I be in the 45%?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There were 45% of us. But I don't want to take up, I know I'm taking up a lot of time, but think about these numbers. It's an institution, right? So there was just under 6,000 people living in a place built for 2,500, all right? 6,000. The highest amount of staff that ever worked at Willowbrook during those years was 2,500. Take out the people that worked Monday to Friday, let's say 500 people. You got 2,000 people left. They go across 7 days and 3 shifts, right? So you figure that there's around 400 people to 500 people available for under 6,000 people to care for them. This is impossible. This can never happen again. I've heard people talk about there's got to be a place, and the economics of it are that it's cheaper. First of all, Willowbrook wasn't cheaper. But the human cost of Willowbrook is just excessive, right? It should never happen again.
Diane, you talked about the understaffing, the underfunding. You were on the inside. Dr. Wilkins, you were there too. Tell us what brought you. Yes, you want to say something?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, hang on one second, Dr. Wilkins. Bernard wants to add one thing.
For us to get good staff in group homes and institution, we got to pay the people above minimum wages. They need to get paid $20 an hour.
They need to be well paid. They need the people that have the right abilities, but you also need to pay them so they can do their jobs.
So we can get good people.
Good people,
Yeah.
good care, good services. They need to be well paid. It's an ongoing fight that we all know about. Thank you. Dr. Wilkins, back to you.
Yeah.
Tell us what brought you to Willowbrook as a young doctor, and why you risked getting fired and exposing what was happening there.
Well, I happened to be on Staten Island doing my internship and first year of internal medicine residency at the United States Public Health Service Hospital. It was on Staten Island at that time. And during my rotation on pediatrics during my internship, we went out to Willowbrook and looked at some quote, funny-looking kids, some unusual inherited abnormalities that caused intellectual disabilities that the chief of pediatrics was interested in. And when I drove through, I was prepared. This is the other half of who I was. I had a friend whose sister had been taken out of the family and placed in the state hospital in Iowa, the state school. And he was so depressed that his sister, and frightened that they would take him too out of the family. And that he was a close friend of mine, and I knew their family, and they were good people. But that was a stain on the family. And then I saw the movie The Snake Pit. It was about a mental institution. And then I read Irving Goffman's book called Asylums. And then in the New Yorker, there was a series called Pilgrim's Progress. It was about the deinstitutionalization of the inmates at Pilgrim State Hospital out on Long Island after the development of drugs which could treat schizophrenia and allow those people to live in the community. And I really thought that all of the people in New York State, certainly, since it's, I'm from Missouri, I'm from Kansas City, I expected New York to be way ahead. And yet, once I started I was driven down this street, I recognized that this was still a warehouse. So Bill, I was a good friend of Bill Bronston. I was involved in the Medical Committee for Human Rights. And what more important persons to fight for the rights of than those who can't fight for themselves. So he and I went to Willowbrook, not knowing exactly what we could do, but knowing that we could probably do something. And I worked there for 18 months, and then I got fired, and Bill stayed on. He had seniority. He had worked there a few months more than me, and so I didn't have enough months to have seniority. But because I stood on the shoulders of other people, and especially the Scandinavians who were so far ahead of us in the way they treated their intellectually disabled. So that's how I ended up there, and why I did call Harella. I was scared, but I was also angry, and on the scale of things, whatever might happen to me, it just wasn't as important as getting the word out about this. And I mean, I didn't know for sure that it would fly, that we would be allowed to put it on the air. But I did have hope, confidence in Geraldo Rivera, and I also thought that surely people are going to realize that this needs to be seen, and it did happen that way.
Thank you for doing what you did. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
But I really love what Diane and everybody has said so far. So I'm going to just yield to everybody who's up there. They're quite good. I'm loving this. Thank you. I tried to be. I spent the whole day in an airport trying to get there.
Oh.
I'm so hugging all of you guys.
We're hugging you right back.
Okay.
We're so glad you're part of this. Even if you couldn't be here in person, this is tremendous. So thank you. And yes, I have a million questions for all of you, but I know we need to keep going, and I want the audience to be able to ask some questions too. So let's get to Dr. Debra Weissbach. Different situation for you here with your brother. Why is it so important for you, Dr. Weissbach, to tell your brother's story and your experience with Willowbrook? And tell us how it's affected your personal and professional life. We know what you do for a living now.
So my brother left home in 1958 when he was almost 6 years old. And it took me years to realize that there was no place for him to go to school, and he needed to go to school. My brother was nonverbal. Maybe he had a couple of words. He became more and more difficult for my parents to take care of, which I didn't really know or understand at the time. And the advice that they were given by professionals, social workers, psychologists, all the people who evaluated him, was that he should be placed and that Willowbrook was the best place for him. And then one day he was just gone. I was approximately 3 years old. My dad went to visit him every Sunday. I understand now that Tuesdays and Sundays were visiting days, but you had to stay outside. I went once. I can remember being there. The very first time I went back to Willowbrook, the buildings looked vaguely familiar, but I never went back. My mother never went after that first visit because it was just too painful. And he basically became a virtual ghost in our family. We never spoke about him. I knew that my dad went. My other extended family never spoke about him. He was always the elephant in the room, and he was just gone, and I never really understood why he disappeared. I was told that he was, quote, mentally retarded, and that's pretty much all I knew. He died in 1968, as I said in the documentary, of, quote, unexplained circumstances, but it was clear that it was due to some kind of trauma. And I didn't go to the funeral. I wasn't taken. I think they were trying to protect me. And it was about 4 years later that the expose from Geraldo Rivera was reported in the news. I was in high school at the time and was horrified. I read the news. I did it discreetly. I would turn the TV on when my parents weren't around, and I would try to figure out what was going on. And it was shameful to me. I couldn't understand why would my parents send their son to this horrible place and just leave him there. Over the years, I pretty much suppressed it. My job as the daughter seemed to be to just keep it quiet, protect my parents. I spent most of my life protecting, especially my mom. And I married, I had 3 children. I became a pediatrician, which I decided I wanted to do when I was 14, a couple of years after he died. I thought it would be a way for me to find answers. And as the years went by, it became apparent that I needed to figure out what happened. And I read, I went back to the archives with my daughter, I walked the grounds, I did research, I searched the internet, and little by little I came to understand that my parents did the only thing they felt that they were able to do. And because it was such a secret in my family, we never spoke about it. And it's really important for me that my brother's life have some kind of meaning. He was a beautiful child, as you saw. I have dreamt about him over the years, and he didn't deserve what happened to him, but I know that it really was not my parents' fault. And after my mom died 4 years ago, I went back on my search. I felt a little bit more free to look for answers. I will share with you that about 3 years ago, I received an envelope from the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of New York, and finally had a copy of his autopsy, which was somewhat stunning to me. It didn't really provide me with any answers. It explained the findings of the autopsy, but I still don't know what happened to him. In the documents that were attached to the autopsy, I learned with horror that my brother lived in Building 6. I already knew about Building 6. I already knew about Geraldo Rivera, Dr. Bronston, and Dr. Wilkins. I knew that that was the building that was entered for the expose, and I think I didn't really talk to my family about it for days after I found this out. It was really quite shocking. I continued my search. I would like to share with you one piece of medical information that some people know, perhaps not everyone knows, about the hepatitis B research studies. Thank you, Bernard. I went to medical school at NYU, where Dr. Saul Krugman was chairman of the Department of Pediatrics for many years. He was no longer chairman when I was there. At the time I was a student, I worked hard, put my nose was in the books. I had sort of pushed my brother out of my mind, and I didn't know until many years later that Dr. Krugman conducted hepatitis B research on the grounds of Willowbrook with the permission of the administration from 1955 to 1970. The arrangement was, I have learned, that because of the overcrowding and difficult enrolling one's child, if you agree to enroll your child and give consent for this study, you are guaranteed better housing. You would be living in better quarters than the general population. So many children were enrolled, and it was felt that this really wasn't a problem. Hepatitis B, as was discussed in the documentary, was rampant. So the thought was, well, the kids are going to get it anyway, so if we use them for this research, we'll learn something, they're doing something good for society, and I mean, who really cares? The research involved intentionally infecting these children with hepatitis, not to be unpleasant. They basically were fed hepatitis B virus that was turned into a milkshake made out of feces of infected children.
Oh,
and they were intentionally infected, and their immune response was studied. And without going into all of the scientific details, some of which I don't understand, this research was conducted over 15 years.
And I said, no.
Good.
They offered Bernard, he said no.
Dr. Krugman was lauded for his work. Yes, he created the hepatitis B vaccine. We probably have all received it. We've all been protected by it. But the ethics of, the ethics of his research, there were no ethics. It was abusive and clearly not up to the standards that we follow today. But I think it's important to remember that. It was at a time that my brother lived there, and I have wondered for years, and I've tried to look for information to see if I could get a list of his research subjects, but they're all numbers, so you really can't find anything. But this kind of research happens. It doesn't happen anymore, but Willowbrook was just one of many. I know that it has sometimes been compared to the Tuskegee experiments. And I think it's important for people to know that Willowbrook children were used for this research, and we need to remember that because we can't ever let that happen again. And it's important that my brother's story be told. I think there are many other children who also died at Willowbrook who unfortunately lived there prior to 1972, when there were parent advocates and there was a lot of activism to change things, and I am so grateful for that. I'm a pediatrician. I take care of many children with physical and developmental disabilities. Some are mild, some are profound. And because of my own personal experience, I am just always amazed, and I guess I shouldn't be because these parents are just doing what they do and what they love to do. I'm always in awe of what they're able to do because my parents weren't able to do that for my brother, and it's what I enjoy about going to work. I don't fight in a public space. Speaking to large groups of people is not really my thing. I spend my day in exam rooms talking to crying babies, toddlers, and extremely irritable adolescents. So
you're doing great, though.
Speaking to all of you is a little bit challenging, but I want Robbie to be remembered. I know that my family loved him, and he is who I have become, and I behave the way I do, I am who I am. I really do believe because of him, and instead of shame, I feel gratitude. Willowbrook really has become a positive force in my life instead of the shameful one that it was for many years. I am amazed with what the Legacy Project has done at the College of Staten Island. It's still amazing to me to see that this is an institution of higher learning, having driven through Staten Island over many years, trying to peer into the grounds, seeing that water tower. in the distance, knowing that Robbie lived there. And I'm just grateful to the parent advocates like Willie Mae and the doctors and Geraldo. And it took years to forgive my parents. I finally forgave my parents, probably a little bit too late. And it's sad, but I know that they never forgave themselves, so maybe they're listening. And I know that they did their best. It was a bad time. We always need to remember, so it doesn't happen again.
Thank you for sharing all of that. They're listening. Thank you for being so candid and for sharing so much, Dr. Weissbach. Jose, you too had a sibling at Willowbrook. As a young child, you became your brother's advocate. You often acted as the interpreter between Willowbrook staff and your mom. Talk about what that experience was like for you as a young child.
So, first of all, I want to thank the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council for a fantastic project, for the opportunity to be before this audience, for being a part of a record, a documentation of that history and how it's important that we don't forget. I appreciate and applaud the audience, the members of the audience who participate in this conversation. And those who are on Livestream, thank you for certainly tuning in and listening to this history, this historical narrative of the lives of people and its impact on those who were at Willowbrook. My brother, Louis Rivera, was born in 1956, disabled, and lived with us for 5 years. My brother suffered from uncontrollable seizures, so my parents, in an effort to monitor his seizures, especially during the overnight, Louis slept between my mom and my dad, so if in the middle of the night he started to convulse, they would know to jump up from bed and rush him over to the local emergency room hospital, where he would, through a series of injections, recover and be able to come back home. But after a while, my parents continued to be told by the doctors and the professionals, this is not good for Louis. Louis needs to be placed in Willowbrook State School, where he'll get the kind of services and the therapies that he needs to be able to live a longer life, is essentially what my parents were told. My parents lived in the Bronx. My father was a super in one of the buildings on the South Bronx. So it was a trip, once we placed Louis in Willowbrook State School, to have to get on the subway, take the ferry, take the bus, and get off at Victory Boulevard to be able to go visit. My parents wanted to make sure that just because Louis was institutionalized and no longer with the family, that we didn't forget that we had a brother that was still a part of the family. So there were 3 boys. I was the oldest, Louis middle child, and my younger brother Jimmy. I would go with my dad on a Sunday, and then my parents would alternate. My younger brother would go with my mom the following Sunday. And it was a way of ensuring that we knew and were familiar with Louis. Louis, as time went on, didn't get the services that we were told he was going to be getting at Willowbrook. Louis walked in, I shouldn't say walked in, Louis was in a wheelchair, but he was able to kick his way around the apartment where we lived in the Bronx. Once in Willowbrook State School, Louis lost the ability of his legs because he wasn't getting the services he required. So Louis, in essence, was becoming more disabled. So the promise that parents like mine were told was in fact a lie. That was not occurring in Willowbrook State School. And so we began to realize that we had to play an important part in Louis's life in order for Louis to survive. Mine is a 2-part story. I have a sort of a part 1 and part 2. So that's part 1 is Willowbrook. And then as the state of New York anticipated the overcrowded conditions, the potential threat of that was on the horizon with the stirrings of the parent group, the advocate doctors who were making clear their unhappiness, they began to recognize that they needed to reduce the census in Willowbrook State School, selected 200 of the most disabled, profoundly retarded individuals, and transferred them to this abandoned building on the Lower East Side, the former old Gouverneur Hospital. This building had been built in the 1800s, had been boarded up by the city of New York in the 1960s because it was so dilapidated and not salvageable. But because the state of New York thought that this group was not going to live long, they thought, how ideal a setup. They entered into a lease agreement with the city of New York and placed 200 of the most disabled individuals in a building that was essentially a fire hazard, not thinking they would live too long. Now became part 2 of my life's chapter, and how I wound up becoming a more active, involved brother, because in Gouverneur State School, the second half of our lives began as there came a time where, because of the deplorable conditions in that state facility, they lost their federal accreditation, their federal funding. And it was also, the state of New York was facing a budget cut. So what did they do? They said, let's take these kids back to Willowbrook, because we can't continue to fund and support the Gouverneur State School. And they sent letters to the parents. And Dr. Hammond's letter basically said, due to budget cuts, we have to close Gouverneur State School. We can no longer fund that facility. So the choice is, you can either take your child back home with you, or you can allow him to be returned back to Willowbrook State School. And we were clear that returning back to Willowbrook State School was a death sentence for our individuals, because we already knew what was occurring in Willowbrook, and what was occurring in Willowbrook was similar in practice and in inadequate staffing and services as what was occurring in Gouverneur. But Gouverneur gave us a different opportunity and an ability to coordinate and organize with families and to work with those hands-on staff who became our partners, because the staff felt they wanted to do the best they could, but they weren't given the resources. They weren't given the supports, the funding. And the parents knew this was our ally. And our children lived years beyond what the state's expectations were. And thus, another issue arose when the state was confronted with the reality that this was a fire trap, a fire hazard, and you need to do something about getting these kids out. And thus became the organization that occurred with Miss Willie Mae Goodman, who was asked by the parent group as we convened the meeting of the parent group, the first parent group meeting, and decided, what do we do? Do we allow our children to go back to Willowbrook, or do we fight the state of New York, the Department of Mental Hygiene? We chose to fight the Department of Mental Hygiene. And we asked Miss Willie Mae Goodman, the parents did, because I was a teenager, young kid, out of high school. Could she be the voice for our kids? And Miss Goodman, who I remember as a young kid, would simply come in to visit her daughter, Margaret, who's back there, by the way, with us today.
Margaret.
67 years old. Margaret's with us, 67 years old. Miss Goodman would come every Sunday, mind her business, just go up to spend time with her daughter, and then leave, So this lady I always felt to be very quiet, sort of kept to herself. All of a sudden she was being asked to lead an effort, to lead a resistance. And it became an interesting time as we now embarked on our second chapter in our fight for advocacy for our disabled individuals, and one that is why I'm here today with you. Life has a funny way of taking you down a path. God chose this path for me because I saw that in my brother's eyes and Lewis's eyes. With each passing day, life was leaving him. He was becoming more and more just losing interest in living because of the lack of stimulation, the lack of any opportunity to experience life and the world outside of the walls of Gouverneur State School. And I just couldn't stand to see my brother gradually die that way. And we embarked on a fight. We embarked on a fight that, by the way, continues to this day. Because you don't give up fighting. You just take pauses here and there and regroup. But you continue to fight. Bernard touched on something that's very important that we can't lose sight of. Our hands-on staff were the key to our success when we were in Gouverneur State School. our hands-on staff are the key to the future of our individuals, because those are the frontline workers who are doing their very best for our individuals who deserve the kind of funding that they need to be able to do the kind of important job caring human beings that they are being expected to perform. So I continue to ensure that the government resources are there for today and for tomorrow's individuals with disabilities. So I applaud the efforts that were being undertaken, but we still have further to go with the needs of our individuals. So thank you.
No doubt about it. Thank you, Jose. We do need to keep fighting. Willie Mae, leading right to Willie Mae, the original parent advocate. You were part of that first parent group. Jose was telling us all about it to prevent your daughter and the other 200 residents from moving back to Willowbrook. And you continue to advocate for your daughter who's with us today and other people with disabilities. So, my question, what do you say to other parents in the audience about becoming a strong advocate for your children?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
When Marguerite was 4 months old, I took her to medical center, and the doctor told me to put her away, that she would never learn to hug me or thank me or whatever. I wrapped Marguerite in a blanket, and I said, she doesn't have to. I got enough for her. At 4 years old, I was told, I asked to let her go to Willowbrook. And they would teach her to walk or talk. And I said, okay, if she walked, I'll bring her home. If she talked, I would bring her home. Unfortunately, she did not do either. She was in Willowbrook for 2 years. When Kennedy went to Willowbrook in 1965 and saw the condition that our kids was in, and he said that it wasn't fit for animals to live. So what they did, they got 200 severely multiple handicapped individuals and took them to Gouverneur. Jose told you the story, the condition of the building, but they did not let us know where our kids were. We had to find the hospital. Nobody told us. We went to visit my daughter that Sunday at Willowbrook. They told me she was not there. They told us she was at Gouverneur. Where is Gouverneur? So we had to find Gouverneur. So we finally found Gouverneur. There was a building, an old building. So we went to visit Marge. We were not allowed to go on the ward where she were. They brought her to us because we was not able. They did not want us to see how our children was taken care of. There are 8 million stores in the next city, and all of us have one. But I always try to say to people, when you have a disability, you're a human being, you're a person, and you have needs. The needs may be different, but it's still a person. And when they got ready to close Gouverneur, Dr. Hammer, Dr. Ginsburg, and Dr. Glasser came down with doctors, went on every ward, and said they're going back to Willowbrook. And I asked them, will they live if they go back to Willowbrook? Dr. Ginsburg told me, no, they would be dead in 6 months. I asked him again. He says, no, they be dead in 6 months. I asked him the third time. He said the same thing. Well, you know what I did? I choked him. When I choked him, 3 big black women had to pull me off of him. And when I came to my senses, I said to him, I will be your queen, but you'll never be my king. And from this day forward, you will never touch another child who has a disability. And that is how we became a strong Gouverneur Parents Association. We knocked on doors, we called people, Percy Sutton, Bella Abza, Merrin Freelancer, Roy Goodman. Those are people long before some of y'all time. They did not know that 200 kids was in Gouverneur. Because you know why? Nobody never saw them. They didn't hear no noise at all. And that is what the state do for kids who have no voice. That's what the state do when people have no identity. That is what they do when they cannot walk and fight for themselves. But when Kennedy went to Willowbrook and our kids came to Gouverneur, we fought very hard. We stayed there night and day, families. Jose was a kid. He couldn't even go home. But that was okay. But we knew what we had to do. We became their voice. We became their legs. We became them. And from this day forward, we will always fight for those who do not have a voice. But they do have a voice. They have your voice. They have my voice. We also have OPWDD voice. But what we got to do, we got to put the voices together for the kids to benefit by it. They got to put away some of the paper and think about people. People first, not paper first. You can write anything on a paper, but if you don't see with your eyes, you know what's right and you know what is wrong. You know, the parents fought a long time ago when they would take our kids to the doctor or they die, they would tell us one thing. We didn't know. So we said, okay, let us have some paperwork. Let's have the case conference. Now, have the case conference, what do you hear? Most of us not true. I'm gonna tell you like it is, okay? But we fought for it and we got it. We walked the street, and when they got ready to close Gouverneur, and we had to go to court, the Gouverneur Parents was the parents who took the state to court by a very good lawyer, by Mary B. Snaps, who had a child like Margaret Goodman. And we worked very hard together. But what we had to do, we had to go out into the community. We went out to the churches, and at that time, it was the Young Lords and the Black Panthers, who a lot of people don't know how they really helped a lot of groups. And our group was one that they helped. We did not go home at night, afraid that the state would come in and take our kids. We stayed there day and night, parents, because the state was going to come in the middle of the night to take the 200 children that did not have no voice. I am what I am. When they got ready to close Gouverneur, I said to myself, I never fought anyone. I never cursed. But I got on a bus. When I got on that bus, I asked the Lord to give me a prayer. And he did. The prayer came. I asked nothing for myself, but to do your will. And whatever your will is, let it be done. When I got off that bus, the sun was shining and big drops of rain hit my face. I knew then what my calling was then, and I know what my calling is now. At 92, I am going to still fight and call, which I call the commissioner every day. Which I have called all of the commissioners every day. But that's okay. They have to hear a voice. They have to know when they're wrong, and they have to know when they're right. Our kids have a right. They're a human being. And I keep repeating, they are not paper. They are people. We moved them out of Willowbrook into the community, but they brought the same ideas from Willowbrook into the community. I have a message that I want to give. Let's do more. Let's not look at them as a piece of paper. Look at them as a person, as an individual who has a need. These kids did not ask to come here. They did not ask to be born. We brought them into the world. We made that choice for them to live, but to live a good life. We say that we cannot take care of our kids like this, like most of us say, but we can help as parents to take care of our kids. We can bring them a life, a spiritual life, a good life. I never believed that OPWDD is the only one can help my kid. I always felt that it was my part and their part, but not for them to cut parents out. You must include parents. We must include you. We must include each other for my kid and all the other kids to benefit by it. You cannot do it alone. The kids need all of us, not one of us, all of us. And we got to start now integrating into the community. You got to bring the community in and not say, oh, they can't come in because it's confidentiality. Confidentiality was a secret for you not to know what was going on with your kid. I hate that word. My baby is 67 years old. They told me when she was 4 months, she wouldn't live to get 2. Dr. Ginsburg told me she would be dead in 6 months, along with others. When Governor Kerri became governor, he was the one who permitted us. He said to me, Goodman, what is it that you want? I don't know what your children want. And I said, we want to visit every day. We want to be able to take care of our kids every day. He says, okay, fine, that's what you have. And he gave it to us. And that is how I got to know 200 kids at Gouverneur. Those 200 kids became my family. And they are my family today. A lot of them have passed away. Some of them are still living. But those who have passed away are still with me. My thing as a parent and other parents, there's some who can't deal with it, but there's some that can. But those who can, help them. Don't criticize them. Don't put obstacles in their way. Don't say what you can and you cannot do. Don't say you can't speak for Tommy. Tommy may not have a parent. So who's going to speak for Tommy? That parent that visits their child.
Willie Mae, thank you.
Because for their child, you get to know and love others. So my thing is to, for OPWDD, for the parents, for the community, let's join together as one. We have done it. We should do it. And I don't know why we cannot do it now.
We need to keep doing it.
And I have a fear. I have a fear that I may see the Willowbrooks again, and I don't want to see the Willowbrooks again. We got to upgrade the group homes. We got to make the environment better. We got to train our staff. We have to be selective for who you hire. You cannot continue on mixing children with high function and children who have different needs. Build those group homes that were supposed to have been built for kids. Why did we stop? We should not stop.
There's still a lot of work to be done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of your insight, for your advocacy. Clearly, as Willie Mae is telling us, there's a lot more to do. We all want to see more change. Look at the standing ovation you're getting. More needs to be done. We know we're not there yet. We're on a path. Thank you, Willie Mae. I want to get to Catherine, Dr. Lavender. As a historian, co-chair of the Willowbrook Legacy Project, we all know how important it is to talk about Willowbrook, to move forward from that, to not be in a situation where group homes become the next Willowbrook. Talk to us, if you would, just about the Legacy Project and what you are doing to make sure that people never forget and that we get to the next step, if you would.
Thank you. And I'm the odd person out here. All of you have been the history makers, and I'm just here to try to keep that story alive. You know, it's really important that we don't forget because of what knowing about the past can prevent us from doing wrong. Part of the story here is that everybody who was there had a history, but it was erased. Even my own college, where the site is, wanted to cover up that it was the home, that it was the site where Willowbrook had formerly been. Previous leadership at the college had said, well, we don't want people to associate Willowbrook with our Institute of Higher Education, which is a ridiculous idea. It implies that there's something shameful in that history and that it needs to be hidden, and that the people who were there are objects of shame. They're not, but they're also not just to be objects of pity. They're people who had dreams and hopes and lives that they wanted to live, that had possibilities, that many of whom entered Willowbrook and lost function, just as you said about Louis, that they went backward, not forward. That's something that we need to know about, that we need to make sure we prevent from ever happening again. And it's way too easy if you don't know the history. I mean, you may know that it existed, but if you don't know that history, it's far too easy for, say, an elected official to make a comment, maybe we made a mistake when we closed Willowbrook. Well, you would have to not understand what Willowbrook is. You'd have to not know the history in order to think that it was a mistake to close it, or to think that we should reopen something like that we should underfund the solutions when Willowbrook was closed, when those solutions, as Willie Mae pointed out, the group homes were created in order to put people back into the community. To underfund them so they become dysfunctional is not the way to fix the problem, obviously. You need to stop thinking about these large institutions like Willowbrook was as if that's some kind of money-saving strategy. It's never going to be a money-saving strategy. If you were ever going to do it in a way that respected the humanity of each person that was in that institution, it would be so much more expensive than you could ever afford. You'd almost need one-to-one caregivers. I don't see that as a possibility. I mean, it's just fiscally not possible. And so you need to think about, if you're trying to save money, like you say, stop treating them like paper. Remember that they're people. To say that we should go back to that is to look at every person who is there with no love in your heart, to not think of them as our children. I mean, Willie Mae makes a really good point. Many of those children, many of those residents, their parents had been coerced into signing them away to the state. And the parents no longer had a voice in those children's lives, and there was really nobody to speak for them but parent advocates who adopted them, either informally or sometimes formally, to provide a voice for them. We, all of us, should be those advocates. We should, all of us, look at those people and say those are our brothers and sisters, and there, but for the grace of God, could go any one of us. One of the things I try to emphasize when I talk with my disability studies students is that, sometimes they'll ask, well, why should I be interested if I'm not myself disabled, or I don't have a person in my immediate family that's disabled? Why should I be advocating for people with disability? And I would say, well, look in the mirror, because it's very likely that most of us are at some point in our lives going to experience some kind of disability. It might be a temporary disability caused by an injury. I myself had to learn how to walk again after a very bad accident. I don't consider myself to be disabled, but for a moment I was in those shoes or in that wheelchair that couldn't get into the voting booth, that couldn't go to where I had a right as a human being and as a citizen to go. So I've had that moment. We're all likely to have that moment. Many of us, people close to us, will become disabled at some point in the future. So if we don't advocate for that, we're not advocating for the humanity in all of us. We really need to take that on. And understanding that history is one way for people to gain access to that. We're on the site of a college, which is part of the City University of New York. The students who walk through our campus and who experience our campus, many of them are inspired by what they see to learn more about Willowbrook, to learn more about the legacy that we've inherited because we're on that site, and the charge of that, the responsibility that comes with that. You can say, as some administrations did, we don't want to associate with that. We want to try to put that in the past and not think about it. It's too painful. It's too ugly. Or you can say, this is something that is a gift to us, that we don't have to live that experience in order to have those insights. We can use those insights to make a better future. Many of our students are focusing on providing services. Many of them are involved in a social work program that focuses on disability. We have an autism spectrum program. We have many different programs that serve the IDD community because we have this connection and this sense of legacy. I think we all should think about that, how many ways we've benefited from this knowledge that these people have been able to share with us tonight, these insights. I mean, it's not an easy thing to talk about family secrets or the disruption of your family necessary in order to try to keep that light of life in your brother's eyes. I'm so thankful that you are willing to share those, and I feel very lucky as an historian to just get a little moment to try to direct some attention to that, to try to preserve it, to make sure it doesn't get erased. That's what's important. And I hope that all of you who've seen this film, this beautiful film, and who've heard these people speaking tonight will go out and think about that and share that with somebody else and encourage them to learn about the local institutions. There are also other institutions beyond Willowbrook, but Willowbrook is the epicenter. It's the starting point, it's the spark. So that's, to me, that's what's important about that.
Thank you, Dr. Lavender. Yeah, it is 8 o'clock, and we appreciate your time so much. We wanted to get to audience questions, but they were so compelling that we were obviously riveted by what they had to say as well. Does anyone have a question real quick that there's something that they want to ask that they really would like an answer to? Do we have a microphone to get? Is there a microphone? Yeah, microphone. Okay. There we go.
I don't necessarily have a question, but all I can say is, after hearing all of your stories, all I can say is, as you guys are truly the founding fathers of disability advocacy. That's all.
Thank you so much. Wish we had more time. I appreciate all of your time. I'm going to let Vicky wrap up, okay? Thank you to our amazing panelists. You inspire me and so many of us.
Okay, this concludes our program for the evening. Please make sure to stop by our information table out in the lobby and fill out our survey in your program before you leave tonight. I want to thank everyone for attending this evening and hope that you share the Willowbrook story and continue to advocate for full community inclusion for people with disabilities. And a big thanks to our panelists, and Christina Arangio for being here with us this evening. Good night, everyone.